Even though it is quite true that any radical eugenics policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see the eugenic problem is explained with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake so that the unthinkable becomes thinkable. And this is where, which I've just found like a magnificent quotation, because it really talks about the fact that they are acknowledging very early on in this cycle, in the early 1900s, that it's going to take.
Yeah, that one's from 1946. That's a speech that was delivered in 1946 during the formulation of UNESCO that ended up being published right around the same time as UNESCO. And don't read it from my video. You go
Read it from his video, guys. Okay,
no,
I mean, yes, go to the original sources, but
yeah, it's a really thin book. It's totally worth the read. This is, the founding of UNESCO is.
And UNESCO is UN, right? What does UNESCO stand for?
Yeah, so it's the United Nations. What is it? It's the United Nations Environment, Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization. Okay. Educational. It was originally the United Nations Education and Cultural Organization, but when Julian Huxley was asked to help be basically the directing secretary to sign it up, what had happened was that he was the head of the intellectual union for the League of Nations. So he was, presiding over the previous versions of UNESCO, so to speak. And when they asked him to do that, he asked them to add an S to the middle to make sure that science was a central focus. So that's why it's not just the United Nations Education and Cultural Organization, and it became the Science Organization, is because Julian Huxley had a prerequisite to his contract.
Perfect. So that quotation blew me away, because as I was saying before, it's like the planning that has gone into the arc of changing how people think over time. And what I know, one of the things that you and I have spoken about privately before is how even the original, that the people acting on this now have almost even forgotten where it came from and the original intent, and that it's
sure.
Like in motion that is just happening, and in many ways started with this kind of effort. So what I'm hoping you could do is to start talking about, and then you even start your first episode with the quotation that I loved. Well, I don't know if this is a quotation or just you starting it off, is that some history is purposely being forgotten. So could you talk about what you meant by that, and how is this being done, and kind of bring us into how this desire to have this population control for, in these people's minds, very good and noble reasons, has led to them trying to engineer how people think over time?
Well, the forgottenness aspect, that came from learning about Julian Huxley, from
really
one,
is everywhere.
Well, that was my doorway. That's the one that blew it wide open. I had originally gotten into the eugenics thread through W.E.B. Du Bois, and I was shocked. I had no idea. I honestly had no concept that Black people were eugenics or were into eugenics. I had that to me was like a shock. I really dug deep.
That Black people themselves were executing eugenic policies.
Oh, that they were eugenicists, that they were indeed like W.E.B. Du Bois was, the NAACP was founded as basically an overarching eugenic organization.
Really?
The entire concept of racialized groups bettering themselves was the whole better people movement. That's so where
you're suggesting that the NAACP's original formation was to improve the Black community through good interbreeding within the Black community?
Well, that was a strong, again, within any organization, you're going to have multiple outlooks and facets.
Sure.
But where they were at the time of their development. Yeah, that's how they got their
Wow, I had
funding.
no
That's how they
idea.
yeah, it was basically the controversy back then where, so like take for example, you go back with eugenics, you go back to Galton. And Galton, even though he was, by all definitions of the word, racist,
Yeah,
without question,
everybody was
he
racist back then, for sure.
a lot of people were, but some people weren't. And it's important to note those people because we talk about dissidents now about talking like, oh, I
Yeah,
rebel on Twitter. No, those were people that were going completely against the grain. They say
yeah,
everything you believe is a lie. You have
yeah.
the whole race construct was getting blown up left and right, but it was by people no one was really, they weren't listening to until later. Now we go back to them. But anyway, yeah, when Galton was first establishing the concepts, one of his major speeches, he was even touching on the fact that, like, the white man's not necessarily superior to the guy in a guy from China, like, but he wasn't saying white man because he's from Britain and they didn't talk like that. He was
Yeah.
basically saying like or he's from England, and he a fellow Englishman and a Chinaman type thing. I don't know what his vernacular was. I would have to quote him, but it wasn't pretty.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
his main point was that the human race as a whole has potential, and that there are people born in China that their potential far outranks most of his countrymen. That the majority of the people being born at the time were a very low quality people, and that's why he was standing up against it. And he's creating this idea: we need better quality people. And the whole idea was throughout every race to rise up and just be the best human race. It was like they were, even though they were staying specific within their own demographics and their own groups. I mean, these concepts took on all over the world. The concept itself is,
So there really wasn't a race. It wasn't like this was something. This was an elite accepted
it's an
that
it's an
crossed racial boundaries, is what you're
it's an
suggesting.
exactly. Well, that's 100%, and that's one of the things I get so disappointed with modern scholars, because they completely miss the mark. They try to
Yeah,
make you, and I felt deceived. Like when I found out what actually happened, I felt
yeah,
deceived, and that's why I wanted to share the information, because I'm not like a slouch. I used to read a lot of history before I got into this. Like I'm a lifelong history buff, and for me to, at that point in my life, 2 years ago, I'm 36 years old. I'm just learning this for the first time, and I'm super like, it blew my mind. And yeah, the whole narrative is that eugenics is some racist ideology. It's a human race ideology. It's a betterment of all people. Now, within that criteria, there are lots of people who definitely fit the definition of racist. And then later on into like the 1910s, and with as they really start picking up steam into the 20s and 30s, then yeah, especially
yeah.
in America, a lot of
So there's a
terribly
lot of
racist
different
stuff comes
flavors
up.
of eugenicists out there, then, right?
100%. But as the core principle, and especially when you scale it back to Oxford, which is where this stuff comes from, it's all comes from Oxford. You just go, if you ever just go to the Oxford Library, and you can figure out anything that's ever happened with all this stuff. It's all of it. Fabianism, eugenics, everything that's changing the world came from a group of dickheads who lived about 100 and something years ago, that just, they were so sure that they were better than everyone else. They built the entire world with
Yeah,
that notion. It was,
fucking Oxford, huh?
I don't know. Like I said, like, I don't know. I don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, because a lot of beautiful stuff came from that. And once you actually understand the eugenic argument, it's not as radical as a lot of people make it, especially when you get past, like, once you push past the racist stuff, like the into, you have the gosh, blanking on his name right now. Let's see, I have the file up now. Well, like, you get into like the Pearls, right? Like Raymond Pearl was a staunch eugenicist, but today historians say like, oh well, he was one of the biggest critics of eugenics. He's not necessarily one of the biggest critics of eugenics. He was a big critic of racial eugenics. So he criticized the racial aspects from it. He was the director of Johns Hopkins, and like one of the most elite minds in the medical world. He was the head of, he was the American version of Julian Huxley.
Okay.
As far as prestige and presence and stuff like that went.
And Julian, wife.
Oh, that would
my
be
wife's
awesome.
last name is Pearl. I gotta look that up.
If she's related to Raymond Pearl, that's something to know. That's really cool. But yeah, I mean, like, you read his stuff, it's not like he abandoned eugenics. He's still like, same with Julian Huxley. He wrote one of the first anti-racist books ever. We Europeans explores the idea of race and basically breaks it down to just a fallacy. And they suggest that's I think the first, if the papers I've read on it are correct, that it's the very first mention of the terminology ethnic group. Like that's, they're the one, like him and Carl Saunders, who was the president of the Eugenics Society at the time, were the first ones to suggest the terminology like ethnic groups.
So so let me try and put this story in a little, you've got this like, which is clearly like liberal elite eugenics thinking, early 1900s. Everybody thinks this is a good idea. And then you get World War II, concentration camps, communists and Nazis and China and doing all this terrible stuff. And I imagine all these concepts get associated with that. But
yeah,
these intellectuals come in, and correct me if I'm wrong here. This is just how I'm seeing the projection of history at this point. They say, "Oh shit, we've got a branding problem."
Yeah.
So can you kind of take us from there? Like, how do they take what they want for results from a population control sort of effort? Because I know this is still popular because I still have friends of mine who are, whatever, naive, they don't know of history, but they're all environmental hippies, and they'll say, well, we've got too many people. So this stuff still has a mental grasp on people. And they feel like the good guys.
There are people who are not having children. They're going to go their whole lives without having children, having no consideration of who's going to take care of them in old age. That is a policy accomplishment. And you can actually watch that policy be developed. Like Kissinger, in the Kissinger report from 1974, which everybody who's interested in this stuff should read, even addresses that as one of the biggest issues left to overcome. By 1974, which is the UN's year of population and where the UN established its plan of action, one of the biggest focuses was, how do we get people to forget that they need at least one kid to survive into old age to take care of them when they're older?
So you're suggesting is that it was an explicit policy goal to get people to forget that they're going to need somebody to take care of them when they get old.
Yeah, I would not necessarily forget that they're going to need to. It's just to not consider that as strongly, or to, just as an example, I'm sure if you ask a lot of younger people with maybe a more naive mindset, who's going to take care of them when they're older? One, a lot of them don't even think they're going to live to be older.
Yeah.
Two, they have this weird idea that the state is going to somehow be there for them. And it's like, bro, there's nobody there for you in this world except for your family. And when that generational cycle, one thing happened when they train girls to start having children later. That's all training. That's all deliberate policy training. That's a bunch of guys in a room talking about how to have less kids. And as a result, we have women having children later into their life cycle. Well, that later into your life cycle means that not only your physical body can't recuperate the same way you could have if you had it while you were young. You could have had 3 kids while you were, pre or early 20s.
Yeah.
And the effects would be relatively gone physically by the time you were in your 30s. If you have a child in your 30s, late 30s, not only could the effects not be just gone, like it could change you for the rest of your life, it could end your life. Like the largest percentage of women that die are women who are giving birth in later in life. It's like anyone who has any consideration for the empowerment of women. Like it's so funny to me that they say like empowering women is letting them have a career till they're 40 and then throwing it all away to have a kid. Like, how is that empowering anybody? What's empowering is raising a bunch of awesome kids who take care of you. You know, if you start having kids by the time you're 20, by the time they're 20, you're 40.
Yeah.
Now you've got a kid that's starting a career, and it's like you can have your career with your kid. Like, what do you even? It's like it's not even a conversation if you really look at the facts. But what it is, it's a programming, and yeah, that programming has been applied to, you know, a great example. China right now, they have their one-child policy. The buy-on for that was tremendous. I mean, so many people didn't like that later on, but the initial buy-on of we're going to have better lives if we limit our families was huge. Well, now their government is being sued by a whole bunch of people whose one child died in a car accident.
Yeah.
Unfortunate things happen. And now these people are turning 60 and 70 years old and they have no one. They have nothing in this world. And they're suing their government because they were lied to. And that's what's happening on a massive scale just to get those numbers dropped.